Hi there, I'm Shufan from University of Waterloo. I will be presenting our work on distance recovery problem. This is joint work with Zhuangfei, Xinda, Professor David Woodruff from CMU, and Professor Hongyang from Waterloo. Imagine there is an unknown point S in a high-dimensional space, and you are asked to locate this point. The only information you can get is a set of other points y and the distance between S and y. We ask what is the minimum size of the set y in order to locate this point. Another way to describe this problem is to use a two-player communication game. We have Bob, which is an oracle, embedded with an input sequence S and a distance function d. The player of Alice wants to guess the sequence S by selecting a set of queries and sending them to Bob, and Bob returns the distance between the input sequence S and the query y. The queries can be either adaptive or non-adaptive, and finally Alice output her guess of the sequence S. The goal of Alice is to make as few queries as possible. Now we ask the query complexity for Alice to win the game. You can pause the video for 10 seconds to think of this problem. You may have noticed that the query complexity may depend on the distance functions. In fact, this problem is not new on some distances. They have been studied even dating back to 1960s, and the results could be found on some pure mathematical journals. For example, if one looks into recovery for Hamming distances, it's related to learning problems such as coin weighing and group testing. On LP norm, the query complexity for mastermind game is known. There are also works on M estimators. But all these distance matrices are decomposable. That is, the distance between two sequences can be written as a sum of some function f on each coordinate of the sequence. We would like to initiate the study of the recovery problem on non-decomposable distances. For non-decomposable distances, sequences are not required to be aligned coordinate by coordinate. Instead, the distance is defined by some implicit optimal alignment as per dynamic programming. There are a large class of distance matrices fitting to this category. For example, we have the added distance, DTW distance, Frechet, Earth-Moore distance, Ulam distance, cascaded norm. Due to time constraint, I will be mainly focusing on talking about the DTW distance, but more results on other distances could be found in our full paper. To introduce DTW distance, we will first introduce the notion of rounds and expansions. Rounds of a sequence X are the maximum substrings with a single repeated character. We use the notion number of rounds to denote the number of rounds in a sequence. Extending any rounds in a sequence gives the expansion of that sequence. To give an example, we have the sequence X. How many rounds are there in this X? There are 5. 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, and 0. X1 bar and X2 bar are the two expansions of X by extending the second round and the third round in X. Next, we define the L1 cost between two aligned expansions of X and Y, which is the L1, basically the L1 norm distance. For instance, the cost between X bar, S1 bar, and X2 bar is 1. So the DTW distance is defined as the minimum cost over all possible pairs of extensions. To continue the running example, given X and Y, the DTW distance is 0, because there exists expansion of X and Y are the same. Here we list an outline of this talk. For the sake of time, we cannot present all the details and the results we obtain. We refer you to the full paper for more technical details if you are interested in our work. One interesting property we observe about this recovery problem on non-decomposable distances is there exist sequences that cannot be distinguished by any distance queries. For this observation, we derive 3 levels of recovery guarantees. We presented the lower bounds for the recovery problem according to different guarantees. Then we studied the adaptive strategies to recover from distance queries Interestingly, there exists a general framework for all non-decomposable distances. We also obtain a list of results for non-adaptive queries. I will present our results on TTW distance. Finally, I will briefly mention some applications and open problems of this work. If you revisit this problem, you may notice that it is not super clear what does it mean by Alice wins the game. Ideally, we would like Alice to output S prime equals to S, which means the exact recovery of the input sequence S. But this is not always possible, especially for some non-decomposable distances. And DDW gives a perfect example showing this. If we set the input sequence S as 0101110, when Alice queries Bob with the sequence 011010, then, as we have seen in the running example, the DDW distance between these two sequences is 0. And S is not equal to yi, but Alice can hardly get more information from this query. In fact, we can prove that this S and yi are not distinguishable by any binary sequences. By this interesting observation, therefore, we derive the 3 levels of recovery guarantees. The strongest guarantee is to recover the exact input sequence. In cases that exact recovery is not possible, we categorize the input space into equivalence classes and look for algorithms to recover a sequence that is in the same equivalence class as the input sequence. The last one is to recover any sequence with 0 distance to input, which is a guarantee provided by the general adaptive recovery framework. This one is the weakest, since the 0 distance does not necessarily mean two sequences are not distinguishable. With this understanding of our problem, now let's move on to more technical details. We obtain a number of results on added distance, TTW, and Frechet distance with optimal or near-optimal query complexity guarantee. First, I would like to show you the lower bounds of the recovery problem. Let's start from a trivial bound for exact recovery, which requires tilde omega n queries. The tilde omega n notation has a log n factor. This lower bound is obtained by an information theoretical proof. First, a query result is an integer in On, which is the information Alice can get in a single query from Bob. And there are 2 to the n plus 1 possible input sequences in the search space. By information theory, we can get a lower bound with n over log n queries. Further, if Alice is allowed to use randomized algorithms, we can actually get the same bound by a reduction from a 2-party, one-way communication game called index. For equivalence class recovery, the lower bound is exactly omega n, but the information theoretical proof does not apply here. This is because the existence of indistinguishable sequences. As shown in this illustrative figure, the input space has been split into blocks of indistinguishable sequences. The size of the search space is no longer 2 to the n plus 1. What's more, the size of the reduced search space is very hard to characterize. So we have to find another way to prove this lower bound. The key insight behind our proof technique is to find the set of sequences such that distinguishing them already needs at least omega n queries. In the proof, we use the known technique of DTW MSS reduction. I will skip the details, but the takeaway here is computing DTW distance between two sequences is equivalent to computing an optimization problem called MSS. The MSS problem is instantiated by these two sequences, and the same MSS instance can imply the same DTW distance. With this reduction, the first observation we made is that For a pair of input sequences with certain pattern, they can be only distinguished by a query with certain number of rounds. This pattern is found by observing certain construction of the MSS instance. So for example, this pair of inputs can only be distinguished by queries with a number of rounds between 4 and 10. We know that this interval is a constant. Keeping this in mind, we show it is able to find O(n) many pairs of input sequences with that pattern, such that distinguishing them requires omega(n) disjoint queries. This proves the ideas of the claim. Then I would like to show you some interesting upper bounds on the query complexity. The first one is a general framework for distance recovery, which works for any distances. The framework is based on a technique we call coordinate descent. Like I said, it is suboptimal and requires contract numbers of queries. We can only get the recovery guarantee zero distance to input. You can regard this coordinate descent as an adaptive optimization framework. What is the loss function in this framework? We can think of the loss function as a distance metric, and our goal is to reduce the loss to zero. So what we do is to change the current query sequence, coordinate by coordinate, as long as we find one to decrease the loss function. And then we repeat this process until we achieve the goal and output the result. Stated more formally, we define a step operation, which is defined as per distances. For example, on add distance, a step function is to add or delete or change a character. We know that one step operation can reduce the loss function at most 1. Finding a step operation to reduce the loss function would require at most O(n) many queries. Since the length of the sequence is at most O(n), then we need to perform O(n) many step operations. Therefore, the overall query complexity for this framework is n squared. Again, this coordinate descent framework is suboptimal, but it fits all non-decomposable distances. For the specialized instantiations on added distance, DTW distance, and frechet distance, we have adaptive strategies that only use O(n) queries, which matches the lower bound of the query complexity. We know that the special properties of the distances are required. Next, I will guide you into our results on DTW distance. I will first briefly mention our results on non-adaptive equivalence class recovery. And since the sequence indistinguishability assumes querying with only binary sequence, later I will show you a more interesting result that if one is allowed to query with a slightly larger alphabet, then we can actually achieve exact recovery with optimal query complexity. So, if you are looking for ways to exactly recover from DTW distance with only binary queries, I have shown you the hardest result by this counterexample. If you are looking for equivalence class recovery, I have shown you the lower bounds, which is omega(n). Now I can tell you the upper bound of the equivalence class recovery, which is also O(n), which matches the query complexity lower bound. We show this by a constructive proof. We came up with these two groups of queries, zeros and ones. They are 0-1 complementary. The essential idea of constructing this set of queries is to cover all possible numbers of rounds for n length sequences. We prove if two sequences cannot be distinguished by the query set, then they are not distinguishable by any binary queries. We can characterize the properties of the sequences which are not distinguishable by this query set. For example, they should have the same number of rounds and have the same first round and last round. With these features, we can do DTW MSS reduction and apply a case analysis. Note that we have a pair of input sequences S and S prime. We show that for any given query Q, the two MSS instances MSSQ and MSSQ, they can give the same solution. This implies they have the same DTW distance. This also shows they are not distinguishable by any queries. For details about this case analysis, we refer you to our full paper. So far, we have shown that if Alice is only allowed to make queries on 0-1 alphabet, then the best result she can get is to use ON queries to recover to the equivalence class. But interestingly, if Alice is allowed to query from an alphabet with 4 characters, 0, 1, 1/3, and 2/5, she can exactly recover the input sequence S with n+2 queries. Again, first I will show you our query construction and show you a sketch of how this is achieved. Let A denote the character 1/3 and B denote the character 2/5. We define the ith query Qi as the first n-I characters filling with A and the following I characters of B. This consists of n queries, and the entire query set contains the single 0 query and a single 1 query as well. You may wonder why we have to use 1/3 and 2/5. In fact, a more general result is possible as long as A and B are co-prime numbers and this inequality holds. But why this set of query can work for exact recovery? To see this, we know that the exact sequence recovery with DTW distance queries requires one to find a way to encode sufficient information for the query and to identify the implicit alignment or the matching between the sequences, which are the two challenges for solving this problem. To see why this would work, let's examine some properties of these queries. The first property of this query is that all of the QIs are monotonic sequences. That is, for its query sequence, its jth character should be less than or equal to its j+1th character. With this property, we can guarantee input uniqueness, which means that each character in the query sequence should be matched to exactly one character in the input sequence. We show that the monotonic sequence construction strategy implies input uniqueness. This property is proved by using triangle inequality such that if there exists a character in the query sequence that matches to more than one character in the input sequence, we can reduce the edge and obtain a new matching with less DTW costs. By repeatedly doing so, input uniqueness is one characterization of the optimal matching when using our query set. What is the benefit of having input uniqueness? That is actually the way we encode information, which solves the challenge 1. The two figures are the DTW matchings with two neighboring queries. You can notice that we both follow input uniqueness. When we change from query Q1 to Q2 by changing the second last character from A to B, the DTW distance query results are only changed from 1 minus A to 1 minus B. Since we know about the query sequences, by doing differentiation, we can obtain whether the second last character in S is 0 or 1. So input uniqueness guarantees a single character in the query only matches to one input character. But how do we know if there are characters in the input that maps to multiple characters in the query? This question leads to our second design choices. We would like to have the query sequence to be 0-1 preferred. That is, as you may have noticed, all characters in our query sequences are less than 1/2. Since matching A or B to zeros in the input sequence has a lower cost than matching to 1, then every 1 in input sequence S only matches to a single character in QI. This design tells us the structure of the DTW matching. So essentially, these two properties of the query sequences can help us recover from the DTW distance. We also use prime and coprime numbers to encode and decode information. We develop algorithms to show how the recovery can be done. You may still have questions about how could we guarantee that changing the query sequence will not change the matchings between the two sequences. We define the notion of isomorphic DTW matching, and we can prove that with our query set, the matching between the input and all query sequences is the same. This is just a bird view sketch of our proof. For more technical details, we refer you to the longer version of our paper on arXiv. Although I have presented our results with DTW distance, we know that all these results can be naturally generalized to PDTW distance. In our paper, we have another set of interesting results on edit distance and fresh edit distance, with either optimal or near optimal query complexities. So far, you might think that these non-decomposable distance recovery problems are wild curiosities that have no conceivable applications. However, the initial motivation for us to think about this problem is from adversarially robust machine learning. As you know, there are machine learning tasks applied on discrete domains. For example, natural language processing or NLP models processes textual data. In adversarial machine learning, one considers an adversary that can make human imperceptible changes to the input so as to fool the model or the classifier. On NLP input domain, a meaningful adversarial perturbation can be defined by edit distance. An example is shown in the figure below. An adversary can change brain in the last sentence to rain, where the edit distance is 1 but the prediction flips. A common way to achieve certified robustness against this adversarial attack is to guarantee the Lipschitzness of the model. But the Lipschitzness is defined over continuous domain. Therefore, we need a mapping that maps the points in the discrete domain to the continuous domain, which is actually related to the word embeddings. Furthermore, we like this mapping to be information preserving to guarantee the model accuracy. We know that our non-adaptive query recovery strategy can naturally yield a way to this type of machine learning robustness. I would also like to mention about the open problems that we do not have perfect solutions. First, on edit distance, the lower bound, which is the one given by the information theory, is omega n, while the best upper bound for non-adaptive queries is squared, if we are restricted to a binary alphabet. We would like to close the conjective gap between lower bound and upper bound in this query complexity. Second, on DTW distance, as I have shown, we have to use 2 extra characters to achieve the optimal query upper bound. But does there exist any ways to reduce the number of extra characters to 1, or is there any hardness result for the number of extra characters? Anyone who solves one of these problems, we are happy to treat you to an all-you-can-eat sushi dinner in Waterloo. Thank you very much for listening. Please scan the QR code for the links to our full paper if you are interested in this work. Please do not hesitate to connect with us if you have any questions. Our email addresses can be found in the paper link.